Hi, my name's Dr. Adam Booth and welcome to another lockdown edition of Quantum Source. Now, when I'm not recording Quantum Source interviews, this is also my work from home office, and I have to say that the lack of variety is starting to wear me down a little bit, because even though I can work without having to shave for months on end, or I can throw on a t-shirt that is full of holes, the lack of social interaction just really starts to grate after a while. But one definite advantage is that I can work whilst playing music as loud as I like, and I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to disturb the bloke in the office next door. I suppose I might have to worry about whether I disturb the neighbour next door, but he hasn't yet raised any complaints, so I can only assume that all's good, right? And I'll crank it up and play some cool stuff. So I have been rediscovering some cool old tunes, the real old classics, and you sometimes wonder why it is that certain tunes stand the test of time and why they seem just as relevant today as they did back in the day that they were written. And so someone who really specialises in understanding this kind of music and the artistry of protest is Dr. Simon Warner. He's a visiting research fellow in popular music studies in the School of Music at the University of Leeds. And we're going to be talking to him today about the origins of the Beat generation, of musical protest, and the legacy that leaves for recording artists today. We're also going to try and assemble a really awesome playlist of the recommended artists that you should be listening to from this generation. Now, music is always served best with a little bit of something refreshing, as indeed is fascinating facts in Quantum Source. And so you could look through the Beat generation and find inspiration in terms of any intoxicating substance that your heart requires. But here I'm distilling it down, and I am going for the core ingredient from a beatnik cocktail, which is a bourbon. So you get yourself something nice. I'm going to give Simon a call, and I'll see you in a minute. Cheers. And good afternoon, Simon. There you are. How's it going?
Adam, it's going really well, thank you.
Cool. Is that really going well, or is this all things considered?
All things considered, you know, the sort of 23 hours in the flat, the house, 1 hour's escape. It's not ideal, let's face it.
It's not ideal, is it? But music is getting me through it, I have to say. So I'm looking forward to a chat about music with you.
Brilliant.
Cool. And what else is getting you through it? Can you recommend me a sauce?
Oh, I can certainly do that. How about this? Hellman's vegan mayonnaise.
Now,
any salad, I tell you.
Now, that is a specialist one. I imagine that's not the kind of thing that disappears from the shelves during stockpiling crises.
You're absolutely right. During the early weeks of this catastrophe, that was still available on Tesco shelves. Am I allowed to mention Tesco? Yeah.
You are allowed to mention Tesco. You definitely are. Yeah. So a specialist kind of sauce recommendation, but one that I'm sure is very, very tasty.
It is indeed.
Now then, we're going to talk about music in the Beat generation. So I was wondering in the first place if you could just give us sort of a potted history of it, and if we were to compile a playlist or a reading list of the key artists and authors, who are we talking about?
Well, the Beat generation are a group of friends who get together in New York City in the middle 1940s, and the principal names who emerge from this get-together are Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs. And while they spread their community across the city as the years go by, across the nation as the years go by, these are the three principal figures. They're the triumvirate who lead the way. And all of them want to write, all of them want to publish, but none of them do it very quickly. Burroughs publishes a book called Junkie in 1953, a story of his own heroin addictions. But I think the most significant moments really come in the middle of the decade when Allen Ginsberg publishes a collection called Howl and Other Poems. Is a remarkable debut by this Jewish New Jerseyite. And then in 1957, Jack Kerouac, after writing massively, hugely, voluminously for years, finally publish his breakthrough book, On the Road.
Yeah.
He's actually published a book before that, which doesn't succeed too well. But on the Road leads him into a period of acclaim, fame, and bizarrely, he goes from being, I wouldn't say a happy-go-lucky individual, but he's seeking after celebrity and critical reception actually turns out quite poorly for him.
Okay. And eventually that sort of, I'm thinking of sort of the Velvet Underground as well going on at this kind of time.
Well, it's a little bit later. I mean, I think it is worth mentioning that, New York has several great cities where creativity goes on, but I think we can pinpoint New York and San Francisco as two key centers.
Okay.
The Beat Generation sow their seeds in New York, spread to San Francisco also. By the early to mid 1960s, New York continues to be a great breeding ground for activity, artistic, political, and so on. Folk movement starts to displace the poets who dominate in the later 50s. In the middle 1960s, you're right to think that bands like the Velvet Underground, New York scene takes on a kind of grittier musical face. We should also mention a band called the Fugs, who combine both poetry and music. In fact, folk rock, the whole mixture. And the Fugs are an interesting link to the earlier era too, because they take their name from the euphemism Norman Mailer has used in his book The Naked and the Dead, often thought of as the greatest novel of World War II. Mailer writes this marvellous novel, but can't use the F word in the book, because in 1947-48, this was not going to be suitable language. And so he peppers his book with regular Fugs.
Okay.
The poets, Ed Sanders, Thule Kufenberg, who formed the Fugs, they rather cleverly, wittily, take this Mailer euphemism. But alongside the Fugs, you're quite right, the Velvets are starting to make their mark. They've met up with this rising, in fact, already well-established artist by 65, Andy Warhol. Warhol wants to bring rock and roll into his art experience. This group of fairly sort of maverick figures, a mixture of the Welsh John Cale, the New Yorker Lou Reed. They're a bunch, I wouldn't say misfits, but they don't fit into a mold very easily.
Yeah.
They are interested in the way poetry in the beat sense can be used in a rock context, because instead of writing songs, as you will know, instead of writing songs about Moon in June or love affairs, they're just as likely to write songs about sadomasochistic sex or drug use and abuse. So they are breaking boundaries by 66, 67. However, at the same time, San Francisco has moved on in a different way, and the sort of gritty urbanism of the Fugs and the Velvets has been replaced by the middle of the decade by this this wave of peace and love. So the two coasts are contrasting in their psychologies by this time. Okay,
I mean that's really interesting, because I've always thought that as time moved on, I've always thought that the Beat Generation, that there was something very edgy and angry about it. Yet you compare that to sort of the hippie movement, which is all about peace and love, and it's easy from an outside perspective to go, okay, those are the guys who are protesting about something, whereas the hippies have just got it easy. Is that a fair thing? Or even though they share this different outlook, they've got the same kind of protest at their heart?
Yes, they have. I mean, they are socially dissatisfied in various ways. They're nonconformists. They want to break with convention. They want to break the codes, but they want to break them to different extents. Just overnight, and this is, I guess, Wednesday, 6th of May, if my calculations are correct. Overnight, I heard about the death of one of the important beat poets. He was a guy called Michael Mcclure. Mcclure was based in San Francisco in the 1950s. And I interviewed him for a book a little while ago. In fact, quite a number of years ago. And we got into a terrible situation. It was the most difficult interview I've ever conducted, because when I suggested to him that the Beats might have been politically disengaged, something that they were accused of at the time, this sent the interview into a crazy spin, because he was so furious at the suggestion that it brings into focus the question that you asked just a minute or two ago. Some of the Beats were uproariously political in their expression. Mcclure, who might be seen as a minor figure, was an ecologist. He was an early environmentalist. But if we think of the three main Beats we mentioned a little while ago, Ginsberg is a committed politico. Burroughs hates the system. He hates structures and organization. He's not a lover of society, but he doesn't really want to do anything about it in a direct sense. Kerouac is really quite a loyal American who sees America as a great country, a great nation. And when the 1960s ticks around and the hippies are citing Kerouac as an influence on them, as a symbol of freedom and individual identity and so on, because On the Road is this great book of travel and searching for some sort of personal holy grail. When the hippies start associating their attitudes to life with Kerouac, Kerouac is outraged, because by this time, the fame factor that we mentioned a little while back, the fame factor has turned him into a stewing alcoholic. He's shifted to the Republican side. He sees Vietnam, which of course is one of the great cause célèbres of the whole period. He sees Vietnam as something that patriotic Americans should support. We should be supporting the army. And so when the demonstrators spill onto the streets from around 65, 66, and those demonstrations become more and more intense, Kerouac in his final years rages against this new subculture. So we've got these contradictions. Ginsberg joins the barricades. Kerouac attacks the concepts that those young people are espousing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So these were criticisms that were leveled at these guys at the time. You said you did this interview and had this almighty row about the politicization. Is this the kind of thing where he rolls his eyes and he says, "Oh, it's this old accusation again"? This is coming back to him directly from the time.
Possibly.
Okay.
Because I was doing research on the relationship between the Beat Generation writers and the rock culture that followed. And in a book called Text and Drugs and Rock and Roll, I explore this, because I was keen to focus on that. I was saying to Mcclure, what did Elvis Presley mean to you? What did the Beatles mean? And so on and so forth. And I think Mcclure started to feel as if his contribution to the discourse had been overshadowed by the literal volume and metaphorical volume of the rock culture. I think some poets felt as if they had been left out in the cold. Some of them managed to find ways to entangle with the new culture. And Mcclure, in fact, befriended Dylan and Jim Morrison. Allen Ginsberg became a huge friend of the Beatles and Dylan and so on. So some of the Beats found a way to merge their literary outlooks with the new commercial, rock and roll that was blasting the world in the later 60s. So there are interesting, different negotiations performed by the writers. But one thing worth saying is that the hip rock stars, the hippest rock stars of the day, like Van Morrison, Jim Morrison, and so on, they want to be associated with the sort of intellectual credibility of the writers. They see in their writing something sexy, hot, interesting, exciting, and they want to make their rock music more credible and powerful. They want to escape the top 40 culture, which is starting to fade by 67, and they want to say important things. And people like Ginsberg and Burroughs are saying things in a way that attracts global serious attention.
Yeah, that's something I've not recognised then, because you kind of think of Dylan as sort of the great folk protester. Actually, what you're suggesting is maybe he's gaming it a little bit, and he's recognised that there's this other market that he'd like to tap into. Do you think that it genuinely changes his outlook then, and so it does kind of edgify him, if you like?
Well, it happens in various ways. Dylan is already starting to take a new approach to songwriting and performance. He arrives in New York in 1961. By 62, 63, he is becoming the god of the folk revival of the time. Yeah. And to a large degree, singing from a traditional repertoire. Folk singers, sing existing material. They don't usually write their own songs. But Dylan wants to break out of that mould and write songs like A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, for example.
Sure, yeah.
Which is a song of odyssey and search and looking for something. And when Ginsberg hears this, he feels as if he has got an heir in waiting. He feels as if the lyricism of this song, which has got all sorts of elusive qualities, feels as if a true poet has emerged in New York City. And on December the 26th, 1963, Ginsberg and Dylan make their first connection. There is a bookstore party, and become then lifelong friends. And Dylan sees Ginsberg and the Beats as heroes, and Ginsberg certainly sees Dylan as a hero too. So there is a mutual admiration society at play.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, a lot of the words that go into songs like that, people often remark how they still have a resonance today, and they stand the test of time. Do you think that at the time, the Beats obviously had something to protest about? Do you think they recognised that protest would carry on through the ages, or were they just interested in saying something there and then?
They grew up in an America which was schizophrenic in mood. The 1950s for white Americans were economically prosperous. It was the decade of the fridge, the radio in the car, all those sort of mod cons that started to symbolize the modern culture of the day. At the same time, as you'll be well aware, Adam, the Americans were living in the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation, because the Cold War was raging, particularly during that time. I think the Beats felt as if America was a very confused place. They wanted identities that were not shaped by notions of communist entryism, or they didn't want to live in a nation that was so paranoid. And so I think their work was about freedoms of different kinds. Burroughs certainly saw narcotics as a way to enter a new world, and of course drugs then as now were largely illegal. Ginsberg wanted to express his sexuality. He was a gay man at a time when to be gay was seriously problematic in most of the Western world, if not the whole globe. Kerouac, I think, was a literary stylist who wanted to be a writing revolutionary. And so they had different revolutions in mind. But they were all trying to find identities that did not fit in with the American 2.4 family white picket fence mentality of the middle of the century. So they just did not fit in with what was going on. So the protest was there, but it wasn't quite as formalized as it would become once civil rights started to rear its head, the emancipation, the African American, and then the Vietnam War protests, which by the middle of the 1960s had reached a furious intensity.
So would you say that the Beat generation ever went away? We're still living in kind of with some social political turbulence right now, and it would seem that we've got this kind of like catalyzed potential for a new Beat generation. Do we define an end of that Beat culture, or actually does it just branch off into different areas and it's still around today?
Well, it's a very good question, because one of the reasons the Beats tend to be criticised is that they are heterogeneous. They are male-oriented in their position. Black writers, women writers tend to be on the fringes of what they do. But it's interesting that some of the writers who came through the Beat generation in the 1960s were actually black. Figures like Leroy Jones, who becomes a Mary Baraka, who becomes a black Muslim, Bob Kaufman, Ted Jones. In many ways, those black writers who were perhaps less acclaimed in their day had huge influence on groups like the Last Poets, Gil Scott-Heron, those people who would provide a bridge with the hip-hop movement of the 1970s. And I think 50 years after those signs first started to take shape, they are still massively influencing the world of popular music. I mean, the power of rap is evident to anyone who takes any notice of global popular music. Sure. And I think that notion of using language in inventive, creative ways to backing beats, something that the Beats did with jazz, for example, I think that tradition lives on absolutely powerfully in 2020. Not all those young African Americans would be able to name the Black Beats or any Beats. But if they looked at their history, I think they'd find that there are strands of connection that are definitely there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as well, I'm aware that people either make music or they communicate in a slightly more remote way than maybe they have done before. You said all these sort of the great meetings of various characters from the Beat scene in bookshop parties or in a small smoky cafe. Do you think that that there's a different way in which people kind of protest or make music now that in some way means it's incompatible with that development? Or
I think music has shifted. It has become a different kind of commodity in the decades post-millennium. It's no longer something you can monetize as easily, to use that horrible term, but a term that we live with. In the later 60s, I think popular music wasn't quite regarded as the business it would become. It was seen as an area of interesting creative practice. I mean, in January 1967, the year that the Summer of Love year begins, there's this amazing event in San Francisco called the Human Being. And gathered at that event are the great acid rock bands of the day, the Great Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service. But on the same stage are the great sort of thinkers, philosophers, poets of the day. Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, Michael Mcclure, we mentioned again, Timothy Leary, these sort of figures. And so I think perhaps in 1967, there was a sense of synergy being built between those disparate groups. I'm not saying it doesn't exist today, because clearly social media gives you a chance to reach millions in a way you reach tens of thousands. Yeah. But I don't think music has quite got the power and status it had then. But I qualify that by saying that black music, the music of African America, continues to be such a powerful force that we as white listeners perhaps are less conscious of it than we should be.
Okay. Well, that's definitely one to add to the playlist. And I would say that while talking to you, if the aim of this was to assemble this really awesome playlist to highlight what the Beat generation was and its impact, then you've really given it to us. Just thinking of the impact there, what do you think would be, say, the key three messages that the Beat Generation would want us to have taken away?
Well, I think one of the things that we should mention is ecological matters. In the 1950s, some of the Beats were very early environmentalists, people like Snyder and Mcclure, and clearly 70 years later, those environmental messages are absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. I think also the Beats brought into play the power of pacifism. I think until the 1960s, the West, for 500 years, had built its power on very dubious ideologies: militarism, imperialism, racism, sexism, and so on. Its power was built on those sort of shibboleths. But I think pacifism was one of the things the Beats brought to the hippies and challenged the militarism of which still was seen as the way forward on any front in the 1960s. If they do something, bomb them.
Yeah.
Vietnam showed the world that wasn't going to work. Thirdly, I think I would mention the field of sexual freedom. The idea that in the 1950s, you were a man or you were a woman, you had to be married to have sexual relations and so on. I think one of the things the Beats wanted to bring into play was this sense of identity you could shape for yourself. You could be gay, you could be a feminist woman perhaps, although the relationship with women is sometimes a little bit contentious. But much of what the Beats brought into play was this idea that your identity didn't need to be shaped by the state or the authorities. You could shape it for yourself. So I think those three things, pacifism, ecology, and identity, are all things that remain with us today as powerful messages.
And that's indeed why all of that culture still resonates so much when you hear it, when you read it. It's really great to hear that come through. That's really cool. Simon, we could talk about this all evening, I'm sure. I am going to go and listen to some music right now. But I'll say thank you for a really good contribution to Quantum Source. What I would say is that if anyone out there does want to put any questions to Simon, then they can find us online on the Quantum Source Twitter account. Post something there, then I can put it Simon's way, or he can have eyes on it. Would that be okay if people get in touch with you, Simon?
Adam, that will be absolutely fine. And it's been great fielding your questions, and I hope we've come up with some half-decent answers.
They've been really fascinating. So, thank you very much, Simon, and I wish you a good evening.
Thank you. Same to you, Adam.
Cheers now. Bye-bye. So what can I say? A playlist recommendation from Quantum Source. Go download some tunes, go listen to the lyrics, and bear in mind the message that it's given you for today. Now then, for tomorrow, we're going to be uploading more podcasts, so keep your eyes peeled on the Quantum Source Twitter and Instagram accounts. We will be uploading more fascinating facts and scintillating science to keep you entertained during the lockdown. Just remains for me to say, I've been Dr. Adam Booth, you've been great, this has been Quantum Source, and we'll see you soon. Take it easy.